The morning Esther Fairchild walked into that courtroom, the whole town of Calico Bend held its breath like a man waiting for a noose to tighten. It was the autumn of 1882, in the dry, sun-scorched territory of New Mexico, where the dust never truly settled and justice was a word that meant different things depending on how much land a man owned. The Santa Fe Railroad had been pushing through the territory for 2 years now, and with it came lawyers and bankers and men in pressed suits who had never once calloused their hands on honest work, but who knew precisely how to fold a paper in a way that stripped a family of everything it had ever known. Esther had buried her husband, Thomas Fairchild, exactly 4 months prior. He had died of a fever that came on fast and left fast, taking him with it before the doctor from Silver Creek could even make the 3-day ride. Thomas had been a good man, a quiet man, the kind of man who rose before the sun and walked the fence lines every evening to make sure everything was still standing. He had loved Esther with the steady, unhurried love of someone who had chosen her deliberately and never once doubted that choice. He had also left behind, through no fault of his own, a debt. The debt was not enormous. $460 owed to the Territorial Bank of Calico Bend, a loan taken 3 years ago to repair the well and replace a collapsing barn roof after the worst summer storm in memory had torn through the valley. Thomas had been paying it back in faithful installments, never once missing a payment, until the fever came. And in the chaos of grief and burial arrangements and the sheer breathtaking weight of suddenly being alone on a 120-acre ranch with 2 children and not enough hands, Esther had missed 2 payments. 2 payments. The bank, under the direction of its new manager, a man named Cornelius Vaught who had arrived from back east 6 months ago with slicked hair, and a watch chain that probably cost more than most families in Calico Bend earned in a year, had moved with startling speed. He filed the foreclosure notice within a week of the second missed payment, citing a clause in the original loan agreement that allowed acceleration of the full debt in the event of delinquency. The hearing was set for October the 3rd, 1882, a Tuesday. Esther had no lawyer. She had no money for a lawyer. She had her children, Clara, who was 9, and William, who was 7, and she had the ranch, the same land her late husband's father had homesteaded in 1864, and she had the Sunday dress she put on that morning because it was the best thing she owned, and she was not going to walk into that hearing looking like she had already surrendered. The dress was pale blue, the color of a winter sky just before it snows, with small white buttons up the front and a collar that her mother had trimmed with lace so fine it looked like something from a picture book. She had pressed it the night before, heating the iron on the stovetop until it was just right, working the fabric smooth with the kind of focused precision she usually reserved for things that truly mattered. She pinned her dark hair up carefully, checked her face in the small mirror above the washstand, and then sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her hands for a long moment. Clara came in quietly and stood beside her. "Are you going to cry, Mama?" the girl asked. "No," Esther said. And she meant it. She had done her crying. 4 months of it in the dark in the barn, pressed against the horse's warm flank so the children would not hear. She was done with crying. Now she had to think. She left the children with their neighbor, Ada Mayers, who lived 2 miles east and who had brought over 3 pies and a pot of chili in the first week after Thomas died and had never once asked for anything back. Ada hugged Esther at the door and said, "You go in there and you look that snake in the eye," and Esther nodded and climbed into the wagon and drove into town. Calico Bend was not a large town, but it was not small either. It had a proper main street with a general store, a hotel, a barber shop, 2 saloons, a land office, and the territorial courthouse, which was a 2-story adobe building with a wooden porch and an American flag on a pole that always seemed to be slightly crooked. On an ordinary Tuesday, the courthouse handled cattle disputes and the occasional claim-jumping accusation, and whatever else the territorial judge, a man named Beaumont Haas, chose to put on his docket. But today, the foreclosure of the Fairchild Ranch had drawn a crowd. Esther knew most of the faces as she pushed through the double doors. Ranchers and farmers who lived in the valley, men and women who understood exactly what this hearing meant, because it could just as easily have been any one of them standing in her place. Cornelius Vaught sat at the front table with his lawyer, a man named Preston Doyle who wore his coat like he thought it made him taller than he was. They were already shuffling papers and speaking in low, satisfied tones that turned Esther's stomach. She walked to the front of the room. She had no papers, no lawyer, nothing but the Sunday dress and the knowledge that this was her land, and she had earned every inch of it by a way of life that could not simply be reduced to a number on a ledger. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the weight of all that pity and helplessness, and she hated pity more than she had ever hated anything. She did not sit down. She stood at the center aisle and looked at the judge's bench and breathed. And then from the back of the room there was the sound of a chair being pushed back, deliberate, unhurried, the sound of a man who had made a decision. Esther turned. She did not recognize him at first, only registered the impression of him tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a trail-worn canvas coat the color of old tobacco, with dark hair and eyes that caught the courthouse light in a way that was difficult to look away from. He was perhaps 34 or 35, with the kind of face that had spent serious time outdoors and showed it, jaw squared, a scar along the left side of his chin that was old enough to have faded to silver. He was not dressed like a lawyer or a banker. He wore the clothes of a working man, plain trousers, worn boots, a dark vest over a collarless shirt. He had a hat in his hand, held at his side. He stood up from the back before Esther said a single word. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice carrying across the room with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to raise it to be heard, "I'd like to request a continuance on behalf of Mrs. Fairchild." The whole room turned. Judge Beaumont Haas, who had been settling into his chair with the weariness of a man who had already decided how this morning would go, looked up sharply over the rims of his spectacles. "Who are you?" he asked. "Jasper Ralston," the man said. "Attorney at law, admitted to practice in the New Mexico Territory since 1879. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded document which he held up. "My papers, if it pleases the court." Esther stared at him. She had never seen this man before in her life. Preston Doyle was on his feet in an instant, his satisfaction evaporating. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mrs. Fairchild appeared at the preliminary notice unrepresented and made no request for counsel. She didn't have counsel until this morning," Jasper said pleasantly. "That's generally how retaining counsel works." There was a muffled sound from somewhere in the gallery that might have been a laugh. Judge Haas held up a hand for quiet and studied the man at the back of the room for a long moment. "Mr. Ralston, approach." Jasper Ralston walked down the center aisle of that courthouse with the unhurried, steady gait of a man who had never once in his life walked into a room and felt that he did not belong in it. He passed Esther without looking at her, which somehow communicated more than if he had, and handed his papers to the judge's clerk. Haas examined them, glanced at Doyle, and settled back in his chair. "Continuance granted," Haas said. 2 weeks. Parties will reconvene October 17th. He struck the gavel once, and the room began to move. Esther stood at the front of the courtroom and watched Jasper Ralston collect his papers from the clerk. He turned then and met her eyes for the first time directly, and she felt the force of it the way you feel a change in the weather, something shifting in the air, something coming that you cannot name yet. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said, extending his hand. "I apologize for the surprise approach. It was the fastest route to a favorable outcome." She shook his hand. His grip was firm, brief, professional. "You are my lawyer," she said slowly, because she wanted to make absolutely certain she understood the situation, "and I have never met you before. Correct. And you expect no payment." "I expect justice," he said, "which is different." Then he paused, and something in the careful professional face shifted just slightly, became something more human. "I rode into Calico Bend 4 days ago. Heard about your situation from a man at the livery stable. I've seen what Vaught's bank has been doing in 3 other counties. I do not intend to let him do it in this one." Esther looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a professional exchange. Then she looked away. "All right, Mr. Ralston," she said. "I suppose we should talk." They talked in the small room that served as the courthouse's back office, with the late morning light coming in dusty yellow through a high window. Jasper spread the foreclosure documents on the table and read them in the quick, thorough way of someone who had been reading legal papers long enough to know exactly where to look for the hidden catch. Esther watched his face while he read, the small movements of concentration around his eyes, the slight compression of his jaw when he found something he did not like. He found several things he did not like. "This acceleration clause," he said, tapping the paper with one finger, "requires written notice 14 days prior to filing." "Did you receive written notice?" Esther thought. "I received a letter. I was." She paused. It still cost her something to say it plainly. "I was in the middle of burying my husband. I may not have responded within 14 days. "Did the letter arrive more than 14 days before the foreclosure notice was filed?" Esther frowned. "I would have to look. I keep my correspondence in a tin box at the ranch." "Find the letter," Jasper said. "The exact date of receipt matters." He looked up from the papers. "Also, this loan agreement has a provision for hardship deferment. It's in here in language so buried you'd have to know it existed to find it. Mr. Vaught's bank issued this loan, which means his bank is bound by every clause in it, including the deferment provision. A newly widowed woman with minor children and a clean payment history up to the date of her husband's death falls squarely within the definition of qualifying hardship." "They didn't mention that provision," Esther said. "They never do," Jasper said, and for a moment his expression was not professional at all but simply angry, the clean kind of anger that comes from watching something unjust happen to someone who did not deserve it. Esther studied him again in that open way she had, the way Thomas used to call looking right through a person, because she had always been able to read people, and she did not pretend otherwise. What she saw in Jasper Ralston was complicated. He was not a man she could easily categorize. He had the hands of someone who worked outdoors, the calluses, the old sun-darkened skin at the wrist where his sleeve rode up when he wrote, but the legal mind of someone who had spent serious years behind books. There was something careful about him, something controlled, but also something underneath that control that felt like a fire that had been deliberately banked. She did not let herself think about that. She had a ranch to save. They spent the next 2 hours going through the documents line by line, Jasper explaining each point in plain language, treating her like someone capable of understanding her own situation, which she was, and which not every man she had dealt with in the past 4 months had been willing to grant her. When they finished, he rolled the papers back up and looked at her across the table. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to." "Go ahead," she said. "If we win this hearing, and I believe we will, what happens next? The debt is still outstanding. Can you make the payments?" Esther was quiet for a moment. It was a fair question and a hard one. The ranch brought in enough to live on, but the cattle prices had been soft all summer, and she had one hired hand, an older Mexican man named Felipe Garza who had worked for Thomas for 6 years, and who had quietly kept working after Thomas died, accepting a reduced wage that Esther suspected he had proposed partly out of loyalty and partly out of pride in the land itself. With what she had coming in from the fall cattle sale and the 2 remaining seasons of hay she could cut from the back fields, she could probably make the payments. But it would be tight, the kind of tight that did not allow for anything to go wrong. "I can manage it," she said. "If the payments remain as they were structured." He nodded. "Then that's what we will argue for. Full reinstatement of the original payment schedule, with the missed payments added to the back end of the loan. It's the standard remedy when the acceleration clause is improperly applied." He said it with the confidence of someone who had made this argument before and won, and Esther felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the morning she received that foreclosure notice. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the possibility of hope, which was its own kind of relief. When they stepped back into the main corridor of the courthouse, most of the crowd had dispersed. A few men lingered on the porch, talking in low voices. Cornelius Vaught stood near the front door with Preston Doyle, and he watched Esther and Jasper emerge from the back office with the flat, calculating look of a man who was recalibrating his plan rather than abandoning it. He was a compact man of perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had probably once been pleasant and had since grown into something else. "Mrs. Fairchild," Vaught said, as if he were offering condolences. "I hope, Mr." He glanced at Jasper. "Whoever this gentleman is, I hope he is not filling your head with false expectations. The situation is quite clear." "The situation," Jasper said, holding the door open for Esther with one hand while looking directly at Vaught, "is in litigation, which means anything you might say to Mrs. Fairchild outside of a court of law could constitute improper communication with a represented party. I would consult with your own counsel before saying anything further." Vaught's expression did not change, but his eyes did. Esther walked through the door and down the porch steps into the October sunlight. She paused at the foot of the steps and breathed in the cool, dry air, and looked out at the main street of Calico Bend, with its familiar buildings and its horse-dyed rail, and its cloud of perpetual dust. She felt for the first time in 4 months something that was almost steadiness. She turned to Jasper, who had come down the steps behind her and was settling his hat onto his head. "Where are you staying?" she asked. "The hotel," he said, gesturing along the street. "The hotel is overpriced and the mattresses have had better decades," she said. "I have a spare room at the ranch. You will need to see the land and the property in order to represent it properly." She said it practically, as if she were offering him a view of the pasture rather than a place to sleep. "Besides, I need to find that letter, and the tin box is at home." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, not quite surprise, not quite something else. "That is a generous offer," he said carefully. "It is a practical one," she said. Then she looked at him squarely, and there was something in her dark eyes that was almost but not quite a challenge. "You stood up in that courtroom for me before I said a single word. I think I can offer you a place to sleep." Something in his face changed then. Something subtle, a shift in the quality of the stillness he carried. "All right," he said. "I'll get my things from the hotel." The ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour. The land opened up as they left town, the dry brown grass of October stretching to the low brown mountains in the east, the sky above it all an enormous, clear, almost painful blue. Esther drove the wagon. Jasper sat beside her with his saddlebags and his document case between his boots, looking at the landscape with the quiet attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what he was seeing. "How long have you been a lawyer?" she asked, because the silence had a conversational quality, as if it expected to be filled eventually. 10 years, he said. "Started in Santa Fe, worked for a firm for 5 years, then went on my own." He paused. "I take cases I believe in." "That sounds like a difficult way to make a living," she said. "It is," he agreed without apology. "Were you ever married?" she asked, and then immediately felt the question was too direct too soon and opened her mouth to walk it back. But he answered it without hesitation. "No," he said. "There was a woman once, but she found a man with a more reliable income and a house that didn't move around every few months." He said it without bitterness, more with the rueful acceptance of something long since made peace with. "I'm sorry," Esther said. "Don't be. She was right to do it. I was not at that time a man who was easy to settle a life with." He said this with a frankness that was unusual in her experience of men, who generally preferred to present their histories in the most favorable possible light. It made her trust him more, which she had not expected. They turned off the main road onto the track that led to the Fairchild Ranch, the wagon wheels dropping into the familiar ruts. The house appeared at the top of a gentle rise. A solid adobe structure with a covered porch and 2 cottonwood trees in the front yard that had turned gold, their leaves trembling in the wind. Behind the house, the barn, and beyond the barn, the pasture with the cattle moving slowly in it, and beyond that, the hay fields, and beyond those, the low ridgeline of the mountains. Jasper took it all in without speaking. When they pulled up in front, Ada Mayer's buckboard was still at the hitching post, and Clara and William came running from the side yard with the bounding energy of children who have been confined to good behavior long enough and are now released. They stopped when they saw Jasper and looked at him with the frank, unguarded appraisal of children who had not yet learned to hide their curiosity. "This is Mr. Ralston," Esther said, climbing down from the wagon. "He is going to help us keep the ranch. He will be staying in the spare room for a time." Clara, who was 9 and therefore had opinions about most things, studied Jasper with great seriousness. "Can you ride?" she asked. "I can," Jasper said. "Papa always said you could tell about a man by how he rode," Clara said. "Clara," Esther said. "He sounds like a wise man," Jasper said to Clara, unperturbed. William, who was 7 and had his father's quiet disposition, simply said, "The hay in the spare room is fresh. I put it in last week." He said this with the solemn pride of a boy who had been doing more work than a boy his age should have to do, and Esther felt the familiar compression of grief and love that came over her whenever she looked at her son and saw Thomas in him. Ada Mayers appeared at the porch door, drying her hands on her apron, and looked Jasper over with the efficient once-over of a woman who had been making assessments of people for 60-something years and had gotten very good at it. She said nothing, which in Ada's case meant she was withholding judgment until she had more information. This was practically an endorsement. That evening, Esther found the tin box. It was in the bedroom, on the shelf above the washstand, behind a row of Thomas's books that she had not been able to move. She took it down and brought it to the kitchen table and opened it, spreading the correspondence out. She had a good memory, and she found the bank's letter quickly. She looked at the postmark, looked at the date of receipt she had noted in her own hand on the upper corner of the envelope, and looked up at Jasper, who was across the table with a cup of coffee, watching her. "The letter arrived on August the 8th, she said. "The foreclosure notice was filed on August the 16th. Jasper set down his cup very carefully. "8 days, he said. "8 days, she confirmed. They needed 14. He looked at the letter for a moment, and then something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. "Mrs. Fairchild, I believe we have them." She felt the rush of it, the clean, bright shock of possibility turning into probability, and she had to press her lips together to keep herself from doing something undignified like laughing or crying or both at once. "You are certain?" "A procedurally defective foreclosure notice is a fatal defect in New Mexico territorial law," he said. "It doesn't just slow things down, it voids the proceeding." He picked up the letter and examined the postmark with the careful attention of someone building a case. "We will need a witness to the date of receipt." "Ada Mayers was here that day," Esther said immediately. "She was helping me with the preserves. She saw me open the mail." "Perfect," Jasper said. He set the letter down and looked at Esther across the table, and she noticed that the careful professional expression had relaxed somewhat in the warmth of the kitchen, the lamplight catching the planes of his face and making him look less guarded and more simply human. "This is going to be all right," he said, and he said it with such quiet certainty that she believed him. They sat at the kitchen table a while longer than the conversation strictly required. She told him about the ranch, about the years of building it up, about Thomas's plans for the south field and the cattle he had intended to buy in the spring. She talked about Thomas in the way she talked about him now, with a grief that had settled into her so thoroughly it had become part of the landscape of herself rather than an emergency happening to her. Jasper listened with complete attention, not offering sympathy of the hollow kind but simply listening, which was something she had not had enough of in the past months. At some point she realized the lamp was burning low and Clara and William had been asleep for 2 hours and the evening had gone by without her noticing it go. She stood up to clear the cups and found that she was tired in a way that felt almost good, the tired of someone who had spent a day fighting and had not yet lost. "Thank you," she said, standing at the wash bucket, "for what you did today." He was standing too, gathering his document case. "You don't have to thank me." "I do," she said. "And I will. You didn't have to stand up in that room. You could have come to me separately, introduced yourself properly, gone through the normal channels. You stood up before I said a word, and that mattered more than I can explain to you. Because I was standing there with nothing but a dress and the intention not to fall down, and you—" She stopped. She had not meant to say that much. He looked at her steadily. There was something in that look that was not professional. It was careful and honest, and she recognized it the way you recognize a thing you have been trying not to see. "I saw you walk in," he said. That was enough. The 2 weeks of continuance passed in a kind of organized intensity that Esther would later remember as one of the most alive periods of her life, which surprised her, given the circumstances. Jasper spent the days in methodical preparation, interviewing Ada Mayers, examining the ranch's financial records, writing and rewriting the legal arguments with a focus that excluded almost everything else. In the evenings, though, he was present in a different way. He helped with the evening chores without being asked, mending a section of fence that had come loose on the north pasture, chopping the wood that had piled up since Thomas died. He did these things without commentary, as if it would have been strange to do otherwise. Clara decided she liked him on the third day, when he spent 45 minutes explaining to her how a court case worked using rocks and a tin cup as representatives of the different parties involved. William liked him already, but William had the generous, open-hearted nature of a boy who liked almost everyone and who had been quietly desperate for a man's company without knowing how to say so. Esther watched all of this with a deliberate caution that she applied to herself, the way you apply a bandage to a wound you know has not fully healed. She was a widow of 4 months. She was not a woman who fell quickly or carelessly. And Jasper Ralston was a man who had described himself as not easy to settle a life with, which was the kind of thing she had learned to take seriously when a man said it. But the evenings at the kitchen table kept happening, and the conversations kept being the kind that went on longer than they should have. And she kept noticing things, the way he listened with his whole body, the way he laughed when Clara said something ridiculous, the way he looked at the land at sunset with an expression of something that might have been longing. On the 6th day, it rained. The kind of rain that comes hard and stays, drumming on the adobe roof and turning the yard to mud. The children were restless inside, and Esther made a big pot of corn porridge and sat with them at the table, and they played a card game that Thomas had taught them. A simple game with no gambling, just the pleasure of the cards turning up and the small surprised shouts when something good happened. Jasper sat at the other end of the table with his papers, but he kept looking up at the card game, and finally Clara said, "You can play if you want," with the severity of a 9-year-old granting a significant concession, and he put down his papers and played cards in the lamplight while the rain came down. Later, when the children were in bed, Esther sat by the window watching the rain, and Jasper came and stood near her, not close, but not at the professional distance he usually maintained. They were quiet for a while, listening to the rain. "My father had a ranch," he said, "in Colorado, nothing like this, smaller, but the same kind of feeling, the rain on the roof." "What happened to it?" she asked. "Bank," he said, one word flat as a stone. "When I was 17. A debt my father didn't understand the full terms of, and a banker who understood them very well. He was quiet. We lost everything in about 6 weeks. My father never fully recovered from it. Not the money, the losing of the place, what the place meant." He turned and looked at her. "That is why I stood up this morning, in case you were wondering if it was purely professional. It is not purely professional." Esther looked at him. "I know," she said. "I could see that." The silence after this was different from the other silences, fuller. He looked at her and she looked at him, and something was there between them that neither of them reached for yet, but both of them felt. She looked away first. Outside, the rain ran down the window glass in silver lines. "Jasper," she said. First time she had used his given name. She watched him notice it. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, I want you to know that these 2 weeks have," she paused, organized herself. "I have been alone in a way that has nothing to do with the actual number of people around me, since Thomas died. And these 2 weeks have been different." She lifted her eyes to his. "Thank you for that as well." He was very still. Then he said, "You are welcome," and the weight he put in those 3 words made them mean something much larger. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought, with the clarity of someone who is finally honest enough with herself to admit what she is feeling, that this was dangerous. That she was a widow who had not yet been a widow for half a year, and this man had come into her life at the point of her greatest need, and she could not tell, with any certainty, whether what she felt was genuine or whether it was the feeling of drowning and reaching for whatever was nearest. She thought about that for a long time. Then she thought about the way he had stood up in that courtroom before she said a word, and she thought about the look on his face when he talked about his father's ranch, and she thought about his hands dealing cards in the lamplight while the children shouted, and she decided that she did not think it was drowning. She thought it might actually be seeing. On October 17th, a clear cold morning with frost on the ground and the mountains showing their first thin cap of snow, Esther Fairchild walked into the Calico Bend courthouse again. She wore the same Sunday dress. She had thought about wearing something different and then decided that she was not going to pretend October the 3rd had not happened. Jasper walked in beside her this time. He had spent an hour the previous evening going over the arguments one last time, testing them from every angle, looking for any vulnerability that Doyle might try to exploit. He had found none. His case was clean and tight and correct. The room was fuller than the first time. Word had gotten out, the kind of word that travels through ranch country like a wind, and the gallery was packed with people from the valley. Farmers and ranchers who knew Esther Fairchild, and some who did not know her at all but who came because they understood, in the deep practical way of people whose lives depend on the integrity of the law, that this case was about more than one ranch. Cornelius Vaught sat at his table with Preston Doyle, and both of them wore the kind of careful expressions of men who were working very hard not to show that they were worried. Judge Beaumont Haas took his seat, and the room settled. Jasper presented his case with the clean confidence of someone who is not performing, but simply stating what is true and letting truth do the work. He laid out the procedural defect, the 8-day notice where 14 was required, and entered the bank's letter with its postmark and Esther's dated notation into the record. He called Ada Mayers, who sat in the witness chair with the calm dignity of a woman who had lived 62 years without once lying to anyone, and who stated clearly and without hesitation that she had been present at the Fairchild Ranch on August the 8th, 1882, when the letter from the Territorial Bank of Calico Bend arrived, and that she had seen Mrs. Fairchild receive and open it that day. Doyle tried. He was not a bad lawyer, just an outmatched one. He challenged the relevance of the notification date. He argued that substantial compliance with the notice requirement should suffice. He made several technical objections that Jasper deflected with the brisk efficiency of someone who had anticipated each one. None of it worked. Judge Haas leaned back in his chair and looked at both tables for a long moment. The courtroom was very quiet. "The notice provision in this loan agreement," Haas said, "is unambiguous. 14 days written notice is required prior to filing. The evidence before this court establishes that only 8 days elapse between written notice and the filing of the foreclosure action. This is a material failure to comply with the contractual requirements of the loan agreement. The foreclosure action is therefore dismissed." He looked over his spectacles at Vaught. "The loan is to be reinstated under its original terms, with any missed payments added to the end of the repayment period. The bank is further ordered to bear the costs of these proceedings." He struck the gavel. The room erupted. Not the shouting kind of eruption, but the warm, loud, palpable eruption of a room full of people who have been holding their breath and have been told they can breathe. People clapped. Someone near the back let out a whoop that they immediately tried to muffle. Ada Mayer sat in the witness chair with her hands folded and her eyes bright and did not even try to hide her satisfaction. Esther sat at the table, and for a moment she did not move. She looked at the judge's bench and felt the thing that had been tight inside her for 4 months release completely, felt it go, felt herself breathe all the way down to the bottom of her lungs for what felt like the first time. Then she looked at Jasper, who had gathered his papers and was talking quietly to the clerk, and she felt something else entirely on top of the first feeling, a warm, flooding, impossible to categorize feeling that she did not immediately have the courage to name. He turned and saw her looking, and the professional face was completely gone. He was simply looking at her, and what was in his face was the same thing she was trying not to name in herself, and they looked at each other across the table for a moment that felt like several minutes. Then the courtroom was around them again, and people were coming forward to congratulate Esther, to shake her hand, to clap Jasper on the shoulder with the rough, warm approval of men who judged others by results. A rancher named Cord Haskell, who ran cattle on the north side of the valley, shook Jasper's hand with both of his and said, "Son, if you ever need a meal or a roof in this county, you come to me first." Jasper thanked him and managed to look both gratified and slightly uncomfortable about the attention, which Esther found unexpectedly charming. Cornelius Vaught left the courthouse quickly, without speaking to anyone. Doyle followed him, and neither of them looked at Esther. On the porch of the courthouse, with the cold sunlight coming down hard and the whole town laid out before them, Esther stopped and turned to Jasper. The crowd was moving around them, dispersing, and they were in a small island of relative quiet. "What happens now?" she asked. "For you, I mean, where do you go next?" He looked down the main street for a moment, then he looked at her. "I don't have a fixed destination," he said. "I go where there's work." "Is there work here?" She asked, and she meant it as a practical question, but she heard, even as she asked it, that it was also something else. He heard it too. The stillness he carried changed quality again, became charged with something that was very carefully not being spoken. "That depends," he said. "On what?" she said. "On whether there are reasons to stay." He said it quietly, directly, with the honesty she had come to understand was simply how he was. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was very clear and cold, the kind of light that makes everything look exactly as it is with nothing hidden. She thought about what she knew of him, 10 days of living in close quarters, of evenings at the kitchen table, of watching him be patient with her children and careful with her grief, and honest in ways that cost him something. She thought about Thomas, about the 4 months of grief, about what it meant to be ready or not ready. She thought about the way she had felt when he stood up in that courtroom, the way it had hit her before she even knew who he was, like something recognizing something else. "There might be reasons," she said, "if you were willing to move slowly." The careful, controlled face opened into something she had not seen on him before, a full, genuine, unguarded smile, and she felt the impact of it somewhere in the center of her chest. "Slowly suits me fine," he said. He did not leave Calico Bend. He took a room at the hotel for a few more weeks while he settled the administrative matters following the case, filing the court orders with the bank, ensuring the loan reinstatement was properly recorded, preparing the documentation so that no future manager of the territorial bank could try the same maneuver again. He did this with thoroughness, and he did it without charge, and when Esther tried to press the issue, he simply said that representing the Fairchild Ranch had been the most satisfying work he had done in 3 years and left it at that. He rode out to the ranch most days. Sometimes there was a legal matter to discuss, the completed documentation, the final court orders. But after those were finished, he still rode out most days, and Esther let him, and did not pretend to either of them that it was purely professional. The children adapted to him with the elastic grace of children who have decided a person is acceptable and then simply incorporate them. Clara began consulting him on things with enormous seriousness, presenting him with arguments about whether she should be allowed to stay up later and whether the south pasture would support another horse, as if he were a judge who could be persuaded by a well-organized case. He treated each argument with great solemnity and occasionally conceded the point. William showed him the things he cared about: the snake skin he had found by the creek, the hawk's nest in the big cottonwood, the way the light hit the hay field in the afternoon when it came from the west. Jasper looked at all of these things with genuine interest. In November, the first real cold came. Esther and Felipe spent a week moving the cattle to the winter pasture and checking the fences, and Jasper rode with them, not in the way of a man proving something, but in the easy way of someone who knows livestock and land and is comfortable with both. He worked without being asked and without talking more than necessary, which was exactly the right approach for the kind of work it was, and Felipe, who had maintained a cautious reserve about the newcomer, warmed to him perceptibly. On a Sunday afternoon when the children were napping and the ranch was quiet and the cold air smelled of wood smoke from the stove, Esther and Jasper sat on the porch in their coats and watched the cattle on the far side of the fence and the mountains beyond, white-capped and serious. She had been thinking about something for 2 weeks and she finally said it. "Tell me about the rest of your life," she said. "Not the legal practice, the rest of it." He looked at the mountains. "There isn't much to tell," he said. "I grew up in Colorado. After the ranch was lost, my father took work where he could find it and I went to Santa Fe and studied law with a man who was willing to teach someone without money because he believed in the principle of it. I worked hard. I became good at it. I moved around." He paused. "I have a good mind for arguing, but I am not always easy in company. I am better with land than with rooms full of people. I prefer honesty to tact, which has cost me socially. I read too much for the company I keep in most places." He glanced at her sideways. "I am telling you the unflattering parts because you have been honest with me about things that cost you something, and I think you deserve the same. You are not easy to be around," she asked. "I have not found that." "You are not most people," he said. The thing that had been quietly building between them had reached the point where it was impossible to pretend it was something smaller. They both felt it. They were careful with it in the way of two people who have both been through enough to know that good things are breakable and that some things once lost do not come back. He kissed her on a December evening, not dramatically. It happened at the end of a long evening, when she was walking him to his horse in the cold dark, and they stopped at the fence gate and were standing close because the cold encouraged it. And he looked at her for a moment, asking, and she met his eyes and answered without words, and he kissed her gently, carefully, with all the controlled restraint of a man who felt a great deal more than he was allowing himself to show. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him. He looked at her. The cold air was very still around them. "I am still a widow," she said quietly, not a rejection, just a fact that had to live in the space between them. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. I want you to know that clearly." She studied his face in the moonlight. "And if it takes time, then it takes time," he said, with a patience and certainty that was not resigned but simply genuine. She nodded once. Then she said, "Go home, Jasper," but she said it warmly and he smiled and he went. December passed and January came in cold and hard, the kind of January that tests the construction of every building and the resolve of every person who has chosen to live in the territory. The cattle came through well. The ranch held. Esther made the first payment to the reinstated loan out of the proceeds from the fall cattle sale, and the feeling of handing over that amount at the bank counter, with the new manager behind the glass Cornelius Vaught, had quietly departed Calico Bend in early November, which surprised no one, and having it received without drama or complication, was so disproportionately satisfying that she stood on the bank's porch for a moment afterward just to feel it completely. Jasper had taken a small office above the dry goods store in Calico Bend. He had begun to take local cases, a property dispute between two cattle operations, a contract question for the stagecoach company, a matter involving a homesteading claim, and the town had begun to accept him the way small towns accept people who have proved useful, which is to say without much ceremony, but with a reliability that meant something. People left their horses at the rail outside his office. They brought him their problems and he dealt with them and charged a fair rate and did not overcomplicate things that did not need to be complicated. He came to the ranch for Sunday dinner every week without this ever being formally arranged, simply in the way that a pattern established between people becomes its own kind of understanding. Clara now regarded his presence at the table as entirely normal and had in fact begun assigning him tasks, directing him to open the stuck pickle jar or to reach the tin of preserved peaches from the high shelf. William sat beside him at the table and talked about the ranch with the serious ambition of a boy who was already thinking about what it would look like when he was the one running it. Esther listened to these conversations and felt the complicated warmth of them and did not examine it too closely. On Valentine's Day, which fell on a Tuesday in February 1883 and was cold enough that the puddles had ice at their edges in the morning, Jasper arrived at the ranch in the afternoon without an announced purpose. He had a small package wrapped in brown paper that he left on the kitchen table without ceremony. Inside it was a book, a collection of poetry that she had mentioned once, in passing, weeks ago, had always wanted to read. She had not thought he was listening that closely. She looked at the book for a moment and then looked at him across the kitchen, where he was warming his hands at the stove with his back to her, giving her the moment without making a scene of it. "Jasper," she said. He turned. "Come here," she said. And when he crossed the kitchen, she reached up and took hold of the front of his coat and kissed him the way she had wanted to kiss him for weeks, properly and without reservation, and felt him go very still for just a moment before his arms came around her, and he kissed her back with the full force of everything that had been so carefully banked. When they separated, his forehead came down to rest against hers, and they stood in the kitchen with the stove ticking beside them, and the February light going gray in the window and her hands still on the lapels of his coat. "I love you," he said, quiet and direct, no hedging. "I have not said it before because I did not want to say it before you were ready to hear it, but I am not going to wait any longer to say it." She closed her eyes. She thought of Thomas, as she still did, with the love that does not end just because the person has gone. She thought of what it meant to love someone new, not instead but alongside, not forgetting but continuing. She thought of the long winter evenings and the Sunday dinners and the book he had bought her, because he remembered something she had mentioned once in passing. She thought of the courtroom, October the 3rd, the moment before she said a word. "I love you," she said back, and it was the first time she had said those words to anyone in 4 months, and the weight of what it cost and what it meant made her voice come out quieter than she intended, but he heard it, and the expression that crossed his face was the kind that a person carries in their memory for the rest of their life. They announced nothing publicly. There was nothing to announce yet. But the town of Calico Bend, which was small enough that everything was eventually noticed by everyone, began to register the shape of things. Ada Mayers noticed first, because Ada always noticed first. She said nothing, which was her form of approval. Court Haskell noticed when Jasper bought a particular saddle at the general store that was very clearly not for a solitary man's purposes, and he told his wife, and she was pleased. The question of the future was something Esther and Jasper came to slowly, in pieces. She had the ranch and the children and deep, real roots in a place. He had a practice that was growing and a history of moving, and a way of being that had always prioritized independence. These were not incompatible facts, but they required intention. On an evening in March, walking the fence line in the last of the sunlight because Jasper had come out to the ranch after a long day in the office, and walking the fence was what you did when you needed to think but also needed to move. Esther said, "What do you want it to look like?" "The future." He walked for a moment without answering, and she let him, because she had learned his silences, and this was the kind that was thinking rather than withholding. "I want to wake up on land I know," he said. "I want to practice law in a place that trusts me enough to come to me with its problems. I want to eat dinner with the same people every night." He glanced at her. "I want to not leave this valley." "That would require more than Sunday dinners," she said. "Yes, it would," he agreed. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The fence ran away in both directions into the fading light, and the cattle grazed in the evening quiet, and the mountains were turning purple in the east. "I am not a woman who does things in halves," she said. "If we do this, we do it fully. You would be here on this land. You would be in the children's lives completely, not as a visitor." She looked at him steadily. Clara and William had a father who loved them. They deserve to know that a man can love them without replacing him. I believe you are capable of that, but I am saying it out loud so that there is no confusion. "There is no confusion," he said, "on any of it." "Then you should probably ask me properly," she said, very slightly, the corners of her mouth moving. "Because I was raised to expect that." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, full and warm, the sound of a man who is happy in a way that has surprised even himself. Then he looked at her with the full directness of someone who has never been good at anything less than honest. "Esther Fairchild," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. Then after a beat, "I thought you were going to make it more difficult to get there." "I am a lawyer," he said. "I know when the case is won." They were married in May of 1883, a month that treated the New Mexico territory with unusual generosity, the days warm and the evenings cool, and the land green in a way it was only briefly each year before the summer dried it back. The wedding was held at the ranch, because that was where it belonged. The Reverend Calloway came out from town, and the yard was full of people from the valley, neighbors, ranchers, the families of the valley who had come to the courthouse in October, and who understood what the Fairchild Ranch represented, and who were glad to see it standing. Ada Mayers brought 3 pies. Cord Haskell brought his fiddle and 2 of his sons who could play, and there was dancing on the packed earth yard between the house and the barn that went on past sunset. Felipe Garza, who had stayed on the ranch through the whole ordeal, and whose loyalty had been one of the anchors of the worst months, stood at the back of the ceremony with his hat over his heart and tears running unabashedly down his face, which he made no effort to conceal. Clara wore a white ribbon in her hair and stood beside Esther with the serious dignity of a girl who understood that this was a significant occasion and was determined to honor it properly. William stood beside Jasper and handed him the ring at the correct moment, with such concentrated precision that everyone present felt the weight of how much the boy wanted to get it right. When the Reverend said the words and they were done, when the ring was on Esther's finger and Jasper had kissed her in front of everybody, and the yard erupted in the kind of warm, raucous approval that only a genuine community celebration can produce, Clara grabbed Jasper's hand on one side and William's on the other and said, loudly enough for the entire yard to hear, "Now we are done with the difficult part," which made everyone laugh, including Jasper, who pulled her into a hug that she accepted with the controlled enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who has decided not to make an excessive display of emotion and immediately abandoned that policy. Life settled into itself in the way that good lives do, not with the fanfare of arrival, but with the gradual, solid accumulation of days that become years. Jasper's law practice grew steadily. He handled the legal needs of half the valley within 2 years, and his reputation for taking cases he believed in had not diminished, but had attracted a particular kind of client, people who had a genuine case and needed someone who would actually fight it. He argued 2 matters before the territorial court in Santa Fe in 1884 and won both, and after the second one, A judge told him with great solemnity that he was wasting himself in a small-town practice, to which Jasper replied that he found the term small-town relative, and he was never going back. The ranch prospered. Not dramatically, not with sudden fortune, but with the solid, patient growth of a working operation, managed by two people who both understood land and were not afraid of work. Esther's understanding of the cattle, the pastures, and the seasonal rhythms of the valley was thorough, and Jasper's grasp of contracts and land law meant that they navigated the increasingly complicated legal landscape of a territory on its way to statehood without being caught out the way so many of their neighbors were. In the fall of 1884, their first child together came a boy, born in October on an evening that was cold and clear with stars enormous over the yard. They named him Thomas Jasper Ralston, Thomas first for the father Esther had lost, and the father William and Clara had lost, Jasper for his own father in the order of things, and he arrived in the world with startling vigor, declaring himself immediately and loudly in a way that made the midwife laugh and Jasper, waiting outside the bedroom door, press his forehead against the doorframe and breathe. When Esther let him in and he saw her, tired and damp and entirely capable with the infant in her arms, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at her. "Thomas," he said, and the name was full. "Thomas," she confirmed. Clara, who had been allowed to stay up, appeared in the doorway. She examined the baby with the critical eye of an older sister establishing her position. "He is very small," she said. "You are very small," Esther said. "I was dignified about it," Clara said. William, behind her, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Hello, Thomas," to the baby quietly, as if beginning a conversation that would go on for a very long time, which was exactly what it was. The years that followed were the kind that accumulate into a life without anyone declaring them historic, which is the way the best years work. William grew into a young man with his biological father's quiet steadiness, and his sister claimed Jasper's habit of thinking through problems from the outside in. He took on more of the ranch work as he grew, and it was apparent by the time he was 15 that the ranch was what he wanted and what he was suited for. Jasper taught him about the legal side of ranch operations, the water rights, the grazing agreements, the land surveys with the methodical patience of a man who had learned those things the hard way and wanted the boy to have them as tools rather than discoveries. Clara, who had the same directness and the same capacity for organized argument that characterized both her mother and her stepfather, announced at the age of 12 that she intended to become a teacher, and at 14 revised this to a lawyer, at which point Jasper looked at Esther over Clara's head with an expression of such pure startled pleasure that Esther had to look away to keep from laughing. He began lending Clara his law books and discussing cases with her at the dinner table and treating her arguments with the same serious engagement he brought to his practice, which was, Clara said many years later, the most important thing anyone did for her. Little Thomas grew up the way second-generation children do, with the somewhat unfair advantage of having older siblings who had already worked out what the world expected of children in this family. He was cheerful and quick, and had a gift for horses that surprised even Felipe, who had seen a great many riders in his time. By the time Thomas was 6, Felipe said the boy had hands like a natural, and Felipe did not offer this kind of assessment casually. In 1887, they had another child, a girl this time, whom they named Frances Ada Ralston, Ada for Ada Mayers, who cried when she heard the name and then immediately denied it. Frances was from the first a person of startling personality, loud and determined and full of opinions about everything, which the household accepted with the equanimity of people who have already been through Clara at that age, and know that the appropriate response is to listen carefully and argue back when necessary. The Territorial Bank of Calico Bend went through 2 more managers after Vaught and gradually became a more reasonable institution. its policies less predatory, its treatment of hardship cases more in line with what the actual law required. Jasper was not entirely uninvolved in this improvement, having argued 2 subsequent cases against the bank's practices before the territorial court, and having won both. The bank's board, by 1885, had come to regard the prospect of opposing Ralston in court with significant wariness. Cornelius Vaught himself ended up in Tucson, where he took a position with another bank and attempted similar practices, and ran into a lawyer there who had, he would later discover with some bitterness, trained briefly under Jasper Ralston. That case did not go well for Vaught either. After that, he left the banking industry entirely. On a late afternoon in October of 1889, Esther and Jasper sat on the porch of the ranch house in the old cane chairs that had been there since before Thomas Fairchild died, the chairs that Esther had kept because they were the right chairs for this porch. The sun was going down over the western ridge in the way it did in October, turning the sky above the mountains into a display that never quite lost its power no matter how many times you saw it. 7 years of October sunsets on this porch, she thought. 7 years of this particular light. Clara was in Santa Fe, studying at the small women's college that had opened there, the first in the territory, where she was making a significant reputation for herself and writing letters home every 2 weeks that were, Jasper said, already better argued than most of the briefs he received from opposing counsel. William was at the south fence, riding the evening check with the unhurried competence of a young man who had grown up to be exactly what he wanted to be. Thomas was in the barn with the horses, visible through the open barn door as a small moving shape in the warm hay-smell interior. Frances was on the porch steps, drawing in the dirt with a stick the elaborate map of some territory that existed only in her imagination. Felipe had retired from the heavy ranch work the previous year. He was past 70, and his knees had finally begun their protest. But he still came out 3 mornings a week and sat on the fence and watched the cattle and offered opinions that were inevitably correct. And Esther paid him for these opinions because she said that wisdom was the highest value thing on any operation, and she did not intend to underpay it. Esther had her cup of coffee and the day's newspaper, which came from Santa Fe 3 days late and was read with great seriousness regardless. Jasper had a brief he was reviewing, but it lay in his lap and he was looking at the sunset rather than the brief. He had earned the right to look at the sunset. "Do you remember the first time you saw this place?" Esther asked. He looked at the yard, the cottonwoods in their October gold, the mountains in their evening purple. "You stopped the wagon at the top of the rise," he said. "The house was sitting there and the pasture behind it and the mountains beyond. I thought I had the very clear thought that I would like to sit on the porch of that house and watch the sun go down." "You didn't say that," she said. "No," he said. "I was trying to be professional." She laughed. It was the laugh she had grown into since the dark year, warm and full and located somewhere right in the center of her. He turned and looked at her when she laughed with the expression that had been there from nearly the beginning, the one she had recognized even when she was trying not to like a man who could not believe his good fortune and had stopped trying to hide that he could not. "Jasper," she said. "Yes. Are you happy?" She asked not as a question that required a complex answer, but the way you ask someone to confirm a thing you already know but want to hear. He looked at the yard, at Thomas visible in the barn door now petting the nose of his favorite horse, at Frances and her imaginary map, at the mountains and the sky and the land that had been someone else's grief and had become his belonging. "I never thought about happiness much," he said, "as a category, as something a person could actually plan for." He looked at her. "I thought about work and about what was right and about where I was going. And then you walked into that courthouse in your Sunday dress, and you stood there like a person who had decided that falling was not among the options," and he paused. He was not, for all his courtroom fluency, always good at this, at the feelings made into words. He had gotten better over 7 years. She had helped him get better. and I have not thought about anywhere else since." She reached across the space between the chairs and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers, and they sat that way in the October light, while Frances built her imaginary territory and Thomas talked to his horse, and the cattle stood in the blue evening field, and the mountains held their ancient, reliable position against the sky. The New Mexico Territory became the state of New Mexico 22 years later, in 1912, and by then the Fairchild Ranch, which by that point was the Ralston Ranch as well, though many people in the valley still called it the Fairchild Place out of the long habit of land names, was one of the oldest continuously operating ranches in the county. William ran it. He had married a capable woman named Dorothea Briggs in 1895, and together they had expanded the operation carefully, adding a second pasture tract to the south and a small hay operation that sold to 3 neighboring counties. They had 4 children of their own, and the eldest boy, who was named Thomas William for his grandfather and his own father in the family's established pattern of inheritance through names, could already ride better than most men twice his age. Clara had become a lawyer in 1896, one of only a handful of women admitted to practice in the territory at that time, and she had done it with the characteristic Fairchild Ralston directness of simply outlasting every objection until the objectors gave up. She practiced in Santa Fe and came home to the ranch for holidays and the occasional summer, and when she and Jasper sat together at the dinner table and discussed cases, the rest of the family had learned to simply let it happen and not attempt to interrupt, because neither of them would notice. Thomas, the eldest boy of Esther and Jasper's children, had become the horse trader he had always been going to become, operating out of Albuquerque with a reputation that had spread to 3 territories. He came home when he could, which was not as often as Esther wished, but he wrote long, vivid letters that she kept in a tin box that was, though she did not remark on this, in exactly the same spot on the shelf as the original tin box of correspondence from the year Thomas Fairchild died. Frances, who had been mapping imaginary territories on the porch step at 6, had in fact become something like a map maker. She married a surveyor and lived in Colorado and sent her children to visit the ranch each summer, and those children grew up knowing how to ride and how to argue and how to look at a sunset until they really saw it, which was, Esther thought, everything a childhood ought to give a person. Ada Mayers died in 1898 at the age of 78, full of years and opinion, and having outlived 2 husbands and been satisfied by neither, which she said with great cheerfulness. The funeral was enormous. The whole valley came. Esther stood at the graveside and held Frances's hand and thought about all the pies, all the pots of chili, all the deliberate silences that had been a form of kindness. And she said to Jasper afterward that Ada Mayers was what holding the world together from the inside looked like, and he agreed, which was exactly right. Felipe Garza died in 1901, at an age nobody was completely certain of because Felipe himself had always been vague on the subject, but which was somewhere between 80 and 85. He died in the small house at the edge of the Ralston property that he had lived in since Esther had built it for him in 1886, when the distances from town had become difficult for him. He died comfortable and cared for, which was the least owed to a man who had stayed on a widow's ranch and accepted a reduced wage and kept the place running through the worst months. Esther and Jasper and William and the whole family attended his burial, and Jasper said a few words that were accurate rather than ornamental, which was what Felipe would have wanted. Jasper practiced law until 1908, when he was 60 years old, and the rheumatism in his right hand made the extended writing sessions genuinely painful. He retired from active practice and was immediately consulted by everyone he had ever known as if he had not retired at all, which he accepted with the good humor of a man who understands that some things do not actually stop when you stop being paid for them. He still went into the office 2 mornings a week and reviewed the work of the young lawyer who had taken over his practice, a man named Gates who reminded him somewhat of himself at 30, which he found both encouraging and alarming. Esther ran the household side of the ranch until she was well into her 60s, the part that required the kind of attention that is constant and unglamorous, and without which nothing else functions. She kept accounts, maintained the correspondence, supervised the domestic operation of a place that at any given time housed the family plus seasonal hired hands plus Felipe's replacement, a young man named Hector who had the same steadiness about land that Felipe had had. She also read every book she could get her hands on, including all of the law books in Jasper's library, which she had been working through for 20 years, and which she discussed with him in the evenings with the critical engagement of someone who is not a lawyer, but has lived with the law long enough to have actual opinions about it. She had not forgotten Thomas Fairchild. She had never been asked to, and she would not have if she had been. He was the first man who had loved her and the father of her eldest children, and he was present in the ranch and in William's face and in Clara's stubbornness, and in the name of her firstborn with Jasper. He was part of the geography of her life the way the mountains were part of the geography of the valley, not gone, not removable, simply there, integral, doing what it does by existing. Jasper understood this perfectly and had from the beginning, because he was a man who understood that loving a person fully means making room for everything that made them who they are, including the things that happened before you. What she felt for Jasper was its own thing, different from what she had felt for Thomas, not less, not more, different in the way that two true things can both be true without canceling each other out. She had said this to Clara once, when Clara was older and asking about love with the focused academic interest of someone who was not sure she understood the concept yet, and Clara had thought about it for a long time and then said, "That is the most logical explanation I have ever heard," which was Clara's version of deeply moved. On an evening in October of 1903, October again, always October, the month of the cottonwoods going gold and the mountains turning sharp and clear, and the anniversary of every consequential thing, Esther and Jasper sat on the porch. They were both in their mid-50s. His hair had gone fully gray, and there was more of the old scar visible than there used to be, and he moved with the slight deliberateness of a man who has accumulated decades of physical work in his body. She had lines at the corners of her eyes that deepened when she smiled, which was often, and her dark hair was threaded with silver, and she was, if anything, more beautiful than she had been at 34, which was the kind of thing he told her with the frankness of a man who does not make statements he does not mean. They were watching the grandchildren. William's eldest two were visiting, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, and they were in the yard doing something with a length of rope that appeared to involve a complicated set of rules that both of them understood and neither adult could follow. Thomas was also visiting between trading runs, and he was in the barn doing something to a saddle, the sounds of his work coming occasionally across the yard. 20 years, Esther said. He looked at her. We have been married 20 years, she said, as of last May. 20 years, he confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. And I'm still not ready for the Sunday dinners to stop, she laughed. They are not going to stop. Good, he said. Because I ate alone for a long time before this, and it is a deeply inferior arrangement. She looked at the yard and the children and the mountains beyond, all of it in the late October light that she had watched for 20 years from this particular porch in these particular chairs. She thought about the morning she had put on her Sunday dress and driven into town with nothing but intention and the refusal to fall. She thought about the sound of a chair being pushed back. She thought about a man standing up before she said a word and the whole room turning and herself turning, and the force of that first meeting across a crowded room, the recognition of something she would not understand until later. Jasper, she said. Esther, he said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the 20 years were there between them, full and documented and real, and also there was the thing underneath all of it that had been there since October the 3rd, 1882, and had only ever grown, and she felt it as she always felt it, like something that started in the chest and went all the way through to the edges of herself. "I am going to go make dinner," she said. "I will come in and set the table in a few minutes," he said. "Good," she said. She stood and paused and put her hand briefly on his shoulder as she passed, and he lifted his hand and covered hers for a moment. And that was enough, the way enough things always are, complete in themselves, requiring nothing else, carrying everything. Inside, she started the fire in the stove and brought out the provisions and began to work. And through the window she could see the yard and the children at their rope game, and the light going golden over the whole of it, over the house and the barn and the pasture and the mountains and the land that was hers, and had always been hers, and would go on being hers through William and his children after her. Land that Cornelius Vaught had tried to take with a piece of paper and a procedural maneuver, and had not been able to take. Because on October the 3rd, 1882, a man she had never met had stood up before she said a word and had not sat back down since. The stove ticked warm. The grandchildren shouted something outside. Thomas laughed from the barn. The mountains stood in their October purple, the same as always, the same as they had been before anyone now alive had been alive to see them, reliable and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding at their feet, except that those small human dramas were also, from the inside, everything. Esther put the pot on the stove and stirred it and listened to the house around her, its sounds, its warmth, its full and various life, and was, in the plain, sustainable, real way that matters most, happy.